Well, welcome everyone to the Charter for Compassion's Board Education Network Forum. I'm Charlie Barker. I'll be your moderator for today's program. And I would again like to welcome with a special welcome to Dr. Andrew Garner, who's with us for the second time in about 3 weeks. He was with us about 3 weeks ago to talk about what we would say, well, we had part one and part two. And part one was basically what happens in childhood doesn't remain in childhood, giving us the very basics of our human development from the earliest time of our birth and onward. And today we're going to be hearing something exciting that's beyond the toxic stress that kids can experience, and how to implement relational health within our youth, our babies and our toddlers. So really excited about today. But before I introduce Dr. Garner, for those of you who haven't met him yet, I would like to take our traditional 3 minutes of meditation. Would invite you to take an upright, relaxed position. You may want to close your eyes. You may want to stop your video. And for the next 3 minutes, let's just reflect in terms of what is happening in the world, reflect on our role, our agency in making the changes that need to be made and the transformations that need to be made as we move forward collectively as community. So at the sound of the bell, just simply go into 3 minutes of silent meditation. As we close our time of silent meditation, I would just invite you to come back to your breath and just focus on your breath, breathing in, breathing out, breathing in and breathing out. And when you're ready, with the sound of the bell, gently open your eyes and return to the forum. It gives me really great pleasure again to introduce my friend, Dr. Andy Garner. And I always like to introduce him in reverse fashion from our normal bio, because I know he is a very relational physician and family member. And when he's not spending quality time with his wife, his 2 adult children, and his family dog, Bear, he enjoys hiking, fishing, watching baseball, and then in his spare time, he practices pediatrics, writing about relational health or advocating for children and their families. He's an author and a child advocate. He's a graduate of Swarthmore College has a BA with distinction in psychobiology, the medical scientist training program at Case Western Reserve, in which he received his MD and PhD in neuroscience. He has finished his pediatric residency training at the Children's Hospital in Philadelphia. He has practiced primary care pediatrics at University Hospitals of Cleveland for more than 20 years, and he's a clinical professor of pediatrics at the Cleveland Center. He's co-author of the American Academy of Pediatrics 2 policy statements on childhood toxic stress, and a book in 2018 entitled Thinking Developmentally, Nurturing Wellness in Childhood to Promote Lifelong Health. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Andy, and you have the floor.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Barker, for the invitation, as well as the invitation to be here again. But most importantly, thanks to all of you for joining us. So as Dr. Barker mentioned about 3 weeks ago, I gave part 1, which was what happens in childhood does not stay in childhood. And the focus there was really on the biology of development. And so we talked a little bit about how adverse and positive childhood experiences can sort of be biologically embedded and impact our learning, behavior, and health decades later. And we discussed the concepts of toxic stress and relational health, because the biology of toxic stress, it really helps us define the problem, as it were, at the molecular, cellular, and sort of behavioral levels. But the biology of relational health defines the solutions at the individual, family, and community levels. And so the first few slides, the first dozen slides that I'm going to show today are really sort of a review. So we'll go through them fast, but I want to make sure we're all on the same page about what we mean by toxic stress and relational health. But the conclusion of that, and where we're trying to launch from today, is that preventing toxic stress and sort of preventing the bad stuff just is not enough. If we want kids to thrive, we also have to promote relational health as well. And that's sort of the conclusion of the first part. So our overarching question for today then, after this brief review, is, how, right? How do we really build a culture of relational health? And I don't pretend to have all the answers, but I like to present sort of 3 different lenses, 3 different perspectives, approaches, if you will, that I think will promote sort of the operationalization of this concept of relational health. So I have 3 learning objectives today, and it looks like my computer's not responding. There we go. There it is. The first is to define toxic stress and describe how it elucidates the problem. The second is define relational health and describe how it elucidates the solution. Again, those are sort of brief reviews, but then we're going to really get into the weeds a little bit and describe 3 different lenses that inform efforts to operationalize relational health. And so again, we're going to be talking about the what, the why, and the how. The real overarching issue in what we're talking about today is, how do we understand the links between what happens in childhood and what happens as an adult or an adolescent? And whether or not you're looking at retrospective epidemiological studies or prospective interventional studies, the timeline's the same, right? So there's a childhood experience, there's a big black box, and there's an adult outcome. And on the adversity side of things, we think about the ACEs. There's an adverse childhood experiences study that looked at 10 different kinds of ACEs, and we talked about that in the first part of this. But the bottom line is, on the adversity side, we tend to think about things that are sort of catastrophic and threatening, like violence, abuse, and disasters. But we know that childhood adversity can also take the form of ongoing chronic conditions, things like poverty and racism and social isolation. And those are strongly associated with poor health, academic failure, and economic hardship down the line. But the good news is that's only half the story. We know that positive childhood experiences, attuned adults, opportunities for development and appropriate play, programs like Reach Out and Read and shared reading, those are associated with healthy lifestyles, academic success, and economic stability. And so the trillion-dollar question is, what's going on inside the box? We understand the biology, and we understand, of course, that these are just associations. They're not destiny, right? So we know that some kids have had every possible material advantage, yet do poorly. And so we say they're difficult or doomed, whereas other kids have had significant adversity and they tend to do pretty well. And so we say, well, those kids are resilient. And so if we can understand the biological mechanisms underlying these associations, then we're in a lot better position, not only to prevent the bad stuff, but actually sort of to promote the good stuff, right? So the problem, though, of course, is that the whole concept of adversity, it's pretty subjective, right? And so Jack Schoenkoff and his colleagues at the National Scientific Council on Child Development came up with a taxonomy of stress. And we're looking at the response, because it's really hard to measure adversity from the precipitant because it's so subjective. So one kid hears a dog barking and is terrified, another hears a dog barking, is like, ooh, puppy, let's play, right? And so you're going to have a hard time getting your hand around adversity and measuring and quantifying adversity if you're looking at the precipitant. But we have a lot more information about the stress response. And so he talks about positive stress responses. These are mild, infrequent, and brief episodes of stress. They happen as kids develop, just as part of being a kid. So an inability of a 15-month-old to express their desires, or a 2-year-old who stumbles while running, or beginning of childcare, or even middle schoolers with a big project. Those can be overwhelming, and they will sort of trigger a stress response. But if there are safe, stable, and nurturing relationships, that will allow that stress response to return to baseline pretty quickly. And examples are, responding to nonverbal cues of the 15-month-old, offering consolation to the 2-year-old who stumbles, reassurance or coming back at the end of the day of childcare, and then assisting that middle schooler in breaking up that big project. That can allow that stress response to get turned off. And as a consequence, positive stress actually builds motivation and confidence, right? It builds confidence and actually resilience in the future. I can do this. I've done it before. So the point is that positive stress is not the absence of stress. We're really not trying to put kids in a bubble and make sure nothing bad happens to them, although we'd like to avoid adversity. But we really want to do is give them the skills so that when adversity happens, they know how to handle it in a healthy, adaptive manner. Toxic stress, on the other hand, is sort of the opposite end of the spectrum here, where you have longer lasting, frequent, or strong intensity of stress responses. And you can see how the precipitants of toxic stress could include the more extreme adversities of childhood, things that were included in the adverse childhood experiences study. As a consequence, there's really not enough buffering. There's not enough safe, stable, nurturing relationships to really turn off that stress response. And so kids are sort of bathing in the biological mediators of the stress response, things like cortisol and epinephrine, and that can lead to potentially permanent changes at the biological level. And it can happen sort of at 3 different levels. It can happen at the molecular level, the cellular level, and the behavioral level. And so this is really the meat of the last talk. So I'm just going to go through this briefly, but we know that there are changes at the molecular level, and that gets into this whole field of epigenetics. And so epigenetics means above the genome, and it refers to changes in gene expression that are not due to changes in the DNA sequence. So we're not changing the DNA sequence. We're just determining whether or not that gene actually gets turned on and expressed or not. And so the experts say the best way to think about the genome is to think about it as a very, very complex set of switches. So a gene is like a switch. It's either transcribed and then translated into a protein that has a function, in which case it's expressed, or it's not. So it's on or off. But some of these on-off switches, they're master switches. So if you turn on one gene, you turn on a whole cascade of other genes. So if you turn on this gene, you get an arm, or you get an antenna if you're a bug or something like that. So the point is, there are master genes that are used in development. Some genes are actually very dynamic and change over time. So we know that, for example, like circadian rhythms, genes will get turned on and get turned off as the day goes on. So they're very dynamic. But other genes, and this is the kicker, we know that some genes are sort of programmed early in life, and then they're relatively stable across the lifespan. And so that's how those early experiences can sort of get biologically embedded in terms of epigenetic marks and what genes are getting turned on, what genes are getting turned off. So that's sort of how the environment impacts development at a molecular level. Then you can think about at the cellular level, it's the sort of the way the brain forms. So we know brain connectivity, the wiring of the brain initially and over time is really dependent upon experiences. The activity that happens within the brain is generated by experience, and that activity really helps sculpt and mold the brain. And so when we talk about plasticity, that's the ability of the brain to sort of rewire itself in response to experiences. But we know that that plasticity declines over time. So that's why I say, it's hard to teach an old dog like me new tricks. You want to get it right the first time, right? And so the question is, what connectivity patterns are we strengthening early on in development? Are we strengthening the patterns that are promoting what's called executive function and planning and relationships, or are we promoting the circuits that underlie fear and anxiety and self-preservation? And then there's this idea of behavioral allostasis, and we talked more about this in the first part. But the idea here is that, in physiology, there's this concept of homeostasis. So the body doesn't like a lot of change, right? And so there are mechanisms in place to maintain our sodium levels at a specific level, or our temperature at a specific temperature. And if the environment pushes us out of those ranges, there's an active response to bring it back to normal. It's called allostasis. So if we get too hot, we start sweating. And if our sodium gets too high, we start drinking to try and bring it down. And so allostasis is the body's response to try and get back to normal. So when we're talking about behavioral allostasis, we're talking about behaviors that allow us to return to normal. And we're talking about stress. These are behaviors that at least transiently turn off the stress response. Now, they may be somewhat adaptive in that sense initially, but they can also be maladaptive in the long run, right? For example, there are reasons that people smoke and people get addicted to alcohol and people have promiscuity. Transiently, they may turn off the stress response, but in the long run, they become addictions and unhealthy ways of coping. In fact, one of the participants in the original ACE study said, doc, it's really hard to get enough of something that almost works. So those things that almost work and turn off the stress response, those are examples of behavioral allostasis. So you can see why adversity in childhood is associated with sometimes unhealthy lifestyles down the lane, their coping mechanisms. But the takeaway from the last talk was that the biology that underlies all this toxic stress, it's the same biology that helps us understand how relational health and positive experiences are biologically embedded as well. And so toxic stress and relational health are really sort of two sides of the same coin. So we know, again, if there's adversity in childhood, there are changes in the methylation patterns of the DNA. And one of the examples of that is the glucocorticoid receptor. And if you methylate the glucocorticoid receptor, you may decrease the expression of that receptor in the brain. But that's an important receptor in the brain because it's where cortisol binds. And so it's actually part of a negative feedback loop. If your cortisol and stress level gets too high, the glucocorticoid receptor helps turn off the stress response. But if you've methylated that, the DNA for that receptor, you may have less receptor, you may have less of a break. And so you may actually have more toxic stress. We also know that adversity in childhood can alter EEG patterns. Again, the way the brain's formed are the connectivity patterns. And we just talked about adversity increases the risk for behavioral allostasis. But the flip side then is relational health. So we know that relational health in the form of breastfeeding and tender touch, that actually decreases the methylation of the glucocorticoid receptor. So the good news is that epigenetic patterns aren't necessarily fixed. We can actually change them by implementing procedures that promote relational health. That's the same thing true with the EEG patterns. When we have a program called attachment and biobehavioral catch-up that can normalize the EEG patterns that are seen in kids that have experienced adversity. And finally, relational health helps kids buffer adversity, again, turn off that stress response, and also promotes the skills needed to be resilient. And so the point is that if toxic stress is the problem, relational health really is the solution. And so just to define then relational health, it refers to the ability to develop those and sustain those safe, stable, and nurturing relationships. And these in turn then provide kids with those positive childhood experiences. And so relational health can happen at many ecological levels, right? It can happen at the dyadic level. So as a pediatrician, I think about relational health as being between the parent or caregiver and the child, but it also happens at the familial level in terms of intrafamilial interactions. And it also happens at the community level in terms of what we think is normative behaviors and how we interact with each other. And so one example of this would be something like shared reading. It needs to happen at the dyadic level. It's something that the family values, and hopefully it's something that the community level is valued and supported. But relational health also happens sort of at the provider level in terms of how I, as a pediatric provider, and all of us as professionals interact with patients and families, and then how our staffs and our broader practice supports and other people in our team interact as well with community level interventions that are going to support families. So relational health happens at multiple different levels. But the takeaway is that relational health, again, it buffers adversity. It's sort of in the definition of toxic stress I just gave you before. If there's those social emotional buffers, if there's relational health, that sort of turns off the stress response. And so it's sort of built into definition. Relational health is built into the definition of toxic stress. But an interesting thing for me is that relational health also builds the skills, right? It's scaffolding resilience for the future. That was really sort of the take-home message from the most recent American Academy of Pediatrics policy statement on toxic stress, is that relational health is the antidote to toxic stress. And I'd like to provide just a little data. I did it the last time too, because it's such an important study, I think, that taps into the second idea here, that relational health builds the skills needed to be resilient in the future. So I don't want to get too much in the weeds again, but I'm going to show just a little data here from Christina Bethel. This was a relatively recent study, and they looked at 51,000 parents. That's a large number. And they asked them about their kids. And they defined a child flourishing index, which is basically a measure of executive function, which is really what we want for all of our kids. We think it resides in the prefrontal cortex behind your eyes there, and it's sometimes been called the seat of civilization, right? It's the air traffic controller. It allows us to prioritize, think abstractly, do some planning, also impulse control. And so this child flourishing index, it had to be definitely true that their child was curious, completed things, and was in control of their emotions. So let's be clear, that's a pretty high bar. I'm not sure I meet those criteria on most days. And so the point is, this child flourishing index is a pretty high bar of what we hope for our kids. They also then defined a family resilience and connection index, where they asked the parents, when your family faces a problem, how often are you likely to talk together, work together, remember that you have strengths to draw on, stay hopeful. And then they ask the parents how well they as a couple can share ideas or talk about things, or are handling the day-to-day demands of raising children. So again, they're looking at a child flourishing index and a family resilience and connection index. So nationally, in this national sample, again, more than 50,000 parents, only 40% of the children are flourishing. So you might say that's a pretty low number, but again, it's a pretty high bar, right? The parents had to say that it was always that they were curious, complete, tasks, and are in control. But as you might expect, that flourishing percentage varied as you looked at family resilience and connection. So the kids that had the high levels of family resilience and connection, more of those kids were flourishing. But then they broke it down by ACEs, these adverse childhood experiences, these tremendous adversities that are associated with poor outcomes down the line. And the striking thing is, if you look at kids that had high ACE scores, these are kids that had 4 to 9 ACEs, but they had high family resilience and connection. More of those kids were flourishing than kids that had no ACEs, but also had no family resilience and connection. So this is really, really important take home. It was a light bulb moment for me, because if we're only looking at the adversity, if we're only looking at toxic stress, we're only looking at the bad stuff, we're missing the point. All kids, and particularly kids that have experienced adversity, need relational health in order to flourish. So to just summarize this brief review of what we talked about the last time, what's inside the box? On the adversity side, there's toxic stress. It's leading to changes at the molecular, cellular, and behavioral levels. And on the positive side, there's a safe, stable, and nurturing relationships, relational health that leads to social emotional learning and healthy adaptations. And we also have learned that preventing adversity and toxic stress is not enough. I mean, it's absolutely necessary, but it's not enough, right? We also need to proactively promote relational health and those safe, stable, and nurturing relationships. And so that was sort of the brief review. And then moving forward, then, well, how do we do that? How do we actually build a culture of relational health? And there's this quote by Buckminster Fuller that I like. It says, "You never change things by fighting the existing reality. To change something, build a new model that makes the existing model obsolete." So we got to think outside the box. And the problem, of course, is that a lot of the models and the frameworks that we exist in are deficit-based models, and medicine is number one among them, right? I mean, the medical system literally is funded and functions on the basis of a diagnostic code, which is basically what's wrong with you, and a procedural code, which is what we did to you. Right. And so pediatrics is a little unique in that realm, because pediatrics, we're really interested in trying to get things right the first time. Again, as plasticity declines, as children get older, and again, it's hard to teach an old dog new tricks. We're really interested in trying to get things right the first time. And so that's much more aligned to a strengths-based model, right? And relationships clearly are a strengths-based model. And so why do we need to go beyond toxic stress? Because toxic stress defines the problem, right? How many of our society's most intractable problems, disparities in health and education, economic stability, they're rooted in our shared biology, but divergent experiences and opportunities. But relational health helps us define the solution, right? Explains how individual, family, and community capacities that support the development and maintenance of those safe, stable, nurturing relationships, they buffer adversity and they build resilience across the lifespan. So I'd like to just present the rest of my time now talking about these sort of three lenses that I think will help us sort of operationalize the idea of relational health. The first is a two-generational approach. The second is a developmental approach, and the third is a public health approach. And so the two-generational approach is pretty obvious. You know, we have to partner with parents and caregivers in order to help the children. The developmental approach is getting a little more into the weeds and a little more complicated, but it's really important because affect regulation and relational health are moving targets as children and relationships develop. And then the final thing, probably the most important, and conceptually at least, is that we need layered efforts and across systems in order to make a difference. This is not going to be a magic bullet type thing where there's going to be one thing. I think we tend to always look for the single solution to preventing COVID spread, the single solution to prevent gun violence, the single, these are complex things that need layered approaches where you're going to get 15%, 15%, 15%, 15%, and now we actually make a difference. So in terms of the first idea, though, is that, how do we build a two-generational approach to promote relational health? I love this quote from Yuri Bronfenbrenner. He was the one of the founders of Head Start. And he said, in order to develop normally, I know Dr. Barker loves this quote, right? So in order to develop normally, a child requires progressively more complex joint activity with one or more adults who have an irrational emotional relationship with the child. Somebody's got to be crazy about that kid. That's number one, first, last, and always. So this is really getting at the fact that, relational health, at least initially in life, really is a two-generational, at least, if not multi-generational endeavor. And so the question is, how do we get parents and caregivers out of survival mode, out of their amygdalas and into relational mode? How do we get them into their prefrontal cortex and being able to relate to kids? So if we have caregivers in survival mode, the first thing is, we need to meet their needs, right? We need to meet their social determinants of health, address their childhood adversities, and promote the social supports that they need to get out of their own survival mode. Then if they're in relational mode, then we're more opportunities to develop those safe, stable, nurturing relationships with the child. So now we got a child that's not in survival mode. We got a child that's in relational mode. And then we're in a position to begin scaffolding and building new skills, right? To promote development appropriate play and programs like Reach Out and Read. And ideally, we want to promote those foundational social, emotional, and language skills that allow the child to remain in relational mode, to allow the child to attach to the caregiver. And now, instead of having a vicious cycle of toxic stress, we actually have an auspicious cycle of relational health, right? Where the caregiver's in relational mode, the child's in relational mode, they're each learning new skills and they're both growing, right? But of course, what breaks that cycle? Oops, these got out of line in here. But the thing that breaks that cycle is social determinants of health, right? Unmet caregiver needs is going to break that cycle. This regulate, relate, and reason may sound familiar to those of you who are familiar with the work of Bruce Perry. So Bruce Perry is a psychiatrist in Texas. He recently wrote a book with Oprah Winfrey called What Happened to You? He has a neurosequential model that's roughly related to how the brain processes information. And he says that, we need to regulate, then relate, and then reason. And that's basically what I'm saying here. We need to help the caregivers regulate, then we have to help them relate to the child. And then we're in a position where we can begin building skills and to do the reasoning. So from a kid's perspective, we want adults and caregivers who are able to regulate and relate and then reason. And so these are two different axes. There's the relational health, the regulate and relate, and then there's the reason, which is setting expectations and limits. And so children need both. We know that children need both structure and connection in order to do well. So on one axis, again, you can have the regulate and relate and the relational health, and it can be strong or it can be poor. And on the other axis, we have an emphasis on skill building and reason and structures and expectations and setting limits. And that can be strong or that can be a little. And we know that if you look at the parents that are sort of in this one quadrant here, where they're doing both, they're giving both the connection and the structure, we call that authoritative parenting styles, right? On the other hand, if we have kids that have poor relational health, there's poor regulate and relate, but there's very strong reason, and this is what you expect to do, and setting limits, we call those authoritarian parenting styles. And then if we have lots of connection and regulate and rate, but not a lot of skill building, not a lot of limit setting, we call those sort of permissive parenting styles. And then, of course, if we don't have either, they sort of neglectful, right? We're not providing connection, we're not providing structure. And the relationships between these different parenting styles and childhood attachment, there's limited data, but it looks like kids that have authoritative parenting styles that are getting both the connection and the structure, they're more likely to have secure attachments. And the kids that have sort of no emphasis on skill building and poor relational health, they sort of have disorganized attachments, right? And so that makes it pretty simple, right? It seems like, geez, all we need to do is help parents be more authoritative in their parenting styles. That means we're going to help them promote the relational health and promote skill building. How hard could that be, right? Well, it's actually really complicated, right? So if you think about parenting and parenting interactions, there's sort of three different sort of groups here. You got the child, you've got the parent, and I have the primary care pediatrician here, but it could be any adult in the child and the family's life. And so the child has a behavior, and we tend to label that behavior as being good or bad or helpful or hurtful or age appropriate or not age appropriate. But I tend to think of it, is it adaptive or maladaptive? And that's going to depend on the context. Remember, behavioral stasis may be adaptive initially, but it can be really maladaptive when you get older. Same thing, a kid having a tantrum when you're 3, that's sort of age appropriate, and we might expect that and may actually get the stress out. But when you're 13, we hope we don't have the same behaviors, right? So the point is adaptive or is it maladaptive? And then we've got the parent who has their own behavior, and that behavior we're hoping is going to impact the child's behavior. And so then again, we get into this issue of parenting styles, and people say, well, is it positive parenting? Is it responsive parenting? I would say, is it promoting a safe, stable, and nurturing relationship with the child? Because if we don't have that relationship, there's no scaffolding going on. And then we've got other adults, pediatricians included. We have our own behavior, and we're hoping that behavior is going to impact the parent. It's going to impact the parent's behavior to impact the child, right? So it's a little remote. And we have the same issues with us as providers. We can be authoritarian, right? You must do this as a parent. We know it doesn't work very well, right? We could be indifferent, do what you want. Doesn't work very well. Or we can be, again, authoritative, offering information and sort of partnering as best we can, having the caregiving first and then hoping to build skills. But really comes down to, are we promoting caring, therapeutic relationships with the parent? But this is all going one way, but we know the behavior goes the other way too, right? So the child's behavior can impact the parent, and we can have mismatches in temperament. So if you've got a really strong-willed kid and we got a parent who's not sure how to cope with that, that can cause problems. And the parent behaviors can impact us, right? There's secondary trauma on providers, and there's also unconscious bias and the assumptions we bring to that relationship. So the bottom line here is we want to try and promote therapeutic caring relationships, to promote safe, stable, and nurturing relationships, to promote adaptive responses and adaptive behaviors. So it's through those trusted and respectful relationships that we have with other parents and caregivers. That's how we work to improve relational health in order to improve the health and development of our patients. So, and even this gets tricky. I didn't put a slide in, but there's data out there from a theory called self-determination theory, right? So self-determination theory is that there's two different kinds of motivation. There's intrinsic motivation, something that I want to do because I want to do it. And then there's extrinsic motivation, which again, from a child's perspective would be the parent and everyone else. And from a parent's perspective would be the pediatricians. Like, what are they talking about? That's external. But then there's intrinsic. Intrinsic is what I want to do. So there are three things that drive intrinsic motivation: autonomy, connection, and competence, right? And so we have to be very careful not to be too prescriptive in working with families, because they know their kid best. They know their child best. And so we have to make sure we support parent as well as child autonomy. We have to promote connection, because connection is the relational health, right, that allows us to connect with families in the first place. And then we want to tap into competence. What are they good at? And we want to catch them being good. That's true for parents as well as for kids, right? So that's getting really into the weeds. But the issue here is that a two-generational perspective is incredibly important, right? A lot of people say, well, I have sympathy for the kids. I want to help those poor kids, but I don't have any sympathy for the parents. They made their bed, they need to lie in it. Yeah, but you're cutting your nose to spite your face. If we're not thinking two-generationally and recognizing that policies that impact parents of kids, economic policy, housing policy, childcare policy, family medical leave policies, that's going to in turn impact the next generation. So two-generational perspective, really important. That's the first frame that I think we need to use to try and promote relational health. The second one is a developmental approach. And this one gets even more into the weeds, but I think it's really important to think about that relational health, it reflects skills, right? It's an ability to develop those safe, stable, nurturing relationships. It's a capacity that has some prerequisite skills that you need to bring to the table. But the important thing about skills, of course, is they can be modeled, taught, practiced, reinforced, and hopefully celebrated. And so the point is that, relational health can be learned, right? I mean, there is an innate drive in parents and children to connect. But just like if you're bad at math, we don't say it sucks to be you, we can practice it. The same thing, relational health skills can be learned and practiced. And then the question is, well, how do children, and for that matter, adults, how do we best learn these capacities? So I just want to briefly go back to Bruce Perry again and his idea of, regulate, relate, and then reason, right? So reason refers to thinking and learning, right? The ability to scaffold and learn new skills. But of course, it needs to be developmentally appropriate, right? And so there are models out there for us to look at. Brazelton, who is a very important pediatrician, had a book called Touch Points, which was basically noting new milestones as children develop and using those milestones to promote the relationship. So basic social emotional language skills are the foundation for more advanced skills like self-control and resilience. And so when we're talking about reason, this is what we want to get to, but there are things that we need to do before that, right? So first we have to relate. And so that refers the connection that occurs with this idea called biobehavioral synchrony. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. It's also known as autonomic emotional connection. And this refers to those sort of moments of magic where, you're connecting with someone, you're on the same wavelength, and literally your brain waves and heart rate are on the same wavelength, right? And so responsive, attuned caregivers can turn off the amygdala, which is the on switch for the stress response. And they also turn on the prefrontal cortex and the hippocampus, which is the thinking and learning parts of the brain. So the point is we need to relate before we can think about reasoning. And so the way I like to think about this is, this biobehavioral synchrony, using today's lingo, it's like a bug in our biological code that allows caring adults to hack in remotely and turn off their stress response and turn on the relational part of the brain. And so again, there's this biological connection that can happen that can literally turn off the stress response and turn them out of survival mode and into the thinking learning brain, into relational mode. But before we can do that relating, we need to have caregivers that can relate, right? Regulate refers to having affect regulation in terms of the caregivers. And as kids get older, or rather when they're younger, then it's feeling safe, right? So if you can regulate and turn off the stress response, then we're in a better position to begin relating and then reasoning. So regulates the ability to understand and handle strong emotions in a healthy, adaptive manner, which is one thing for an adult or an adolescent, but it's another thing for a child. But it's still prerequisite for relating, connecting to others, and then reasoning. And so there are important parallel processes we've already alluded to with the previous slide, that, if the caregivers are regulating their own emotions, relating to the caregiver and reasoning, then it's more likely the parent and caregiver is going to regulate, relate, and reason with the child. And we've seen that through home visiting programs and other things. So I want to dig so let's dig a little bit more into this idea of affect regulation. I think it's really important. I'm going to have 2 slides. They're pretty complicated, but it basically gets into the biology of affect regulation and the sort of temporal components, how it happens over time. So in terms of the biology, this should come as no surprise. I sort of hinted at it already. The prefrontal cortex and the hippocampus are the off switches for the stress response, and the amygdala is the on switch for the stress response. The prefrontal cortex and hippocampus, again, this is executive function, the air traffic controller for the brain, and the hippocampus is really important for short-term memory and learning. They allow for conscious, intentional, and adaptive responses to threats and strong emotions. They also have the capacity to shut down the amygdala, which is basically self-regulation. But the problem is they mature later in development. So in fact, the prefrontal cortex is the last part of the brain that develops structurally. So it's not structurally mature until the mid-20s, right? Which in a way is good news. It means, you never give up on kids, right? There's always opportunity for growth. That prefrontal cortex isn't completely developed yet. The amygdala, on the other hand, is the on switch for the stress response. And that allows for sort of subcortical, subconscious, responsive threats. It's a reflective response. It can be impulsive, it can be emotional, and the response can be very aggressive, right? It matures early in development, which may actually be advantageous sort of evolutionarily. When you're young, you may want to shoot first and ask questions later. There may not be it tomorrow, but we hope as you get older, you can engage your prefrontal cortex and see what the options of responses are that may be more adaptive. But there's this seesaw here because the prefrontal cortex shuts down the amygdala, but it doesn't develop till later. The amygdala shuts down the prefrontal cortex and hippocampus. And we know this from our own experience. When we are stressed, when someone puts a gun to your head, you can't even think, you can't get the words out, right? So it literally inhibits the ability to think adaptively or to learn new skills. So young children need those safe, stable, nurturing relationships literally to turn off the amygdala for them, to promote that autonomic emotional connection and the biobehavioral synchrony, so that they can actually be in a position to learn things. And another way to think about this biobehavioral synchrony, it's almost like emotions are contagious, right? We know that, right? I mean, but it goes both ways, right? So, if you're in a mob, you're probably not, cool and calm and collected, right? So those are contagious. So you go on the negative side, but also on the positive side. But the point is, responsive, attuned caregivers can release the brakes on the prefrontal cortex and the hippocampus, and it's going to allow kids to start using the reasoning brain to be creative, to be social, and to learn. But hopefully that's being done, obviously, in the context of relationships. And older kids, they also need those safe, stable, nurturing relationships to promote this idea of social emotional learning. I'm going to get into that in a second because I know it's been sort of controversial recently. But first, I want to focus a little bit on the timing, because the whole point of this developmental approach is acknowledging that the locus for affect regulation moves over time. So in infancy, right, but also ongoing, right, attuned parents and caregivers, they are the locus, as Heather Forkey likes to say. They are the emotional container, right? They are the calm, nurturing, consistently available to turn off that stress response. But it's really hard for parents who never had that to give it, right? And so to help the kids, we need to help the parents and caregivers. And so again, this goes back to the first one in terms of 2 generational. We need to help parents address their ACEs, their mental illness, their substance abuse, their poverty, so they're able to be that emotional container and to be the locus of affect regulation for the child, the young child. But then beginning in infancy, but particularly in the toddler years and also ongoing, then the locus becomes the dance. between the caregiver and the child, right? That is important for affect regulation. So again, that biobehavioral synchrony allows for co-regulation. Again, this idea that emotions are contagious. And if you've ever seen a video, I almost included it, but sometimes the technology gets beyond me. But if you've never seen the Tronic still face experiment, I would urge you all to go and check that. It's on YouTube. So it's TRONICK still face. It's on YouTube. It's an experiment where it's about a 1-year-old child, and they would have the mom interacting with the child, and you can see they're doing the biobehavioral synchrony. They're doing the dyadic dance. There's co-regulation. They're communicating back and forth, non-verbal, but they're communicating back and forth. And then they give the mom a signal, and she turns away. When she comes back, then she is a still face, right? And it's painful to watch, because clearly the child knows something's wrong. We're not regulating anymore. We're not in synchrony anymore, and does everything they can. And it is very stressful for the child. It's really, really painful to watch. The thing that's interesting, though, as we've moved forward, then they have the mom turn away and come back, and they sort of turn the video off then. But very quickly, when the mom begins to engage again, the kid calms down. So this is a really good model for life, and for parents to keep in mind. We cannot always be in sync with our kids. We cannot always be constantly co-regulating with them. That's okay, because we want to work ourselves out of a job anyway. The important thing is the repair. The important thing is when we are unregulated, can we get back into synchrony? Can we repair? Can we come back? Can we connect again? Have we learned to apologize? Have we learned to say, I'm sorry? Have we learned and taught how to reconnect? That reconnection is the more important thing. That when there are breaches in the synchrony, it's going to happen. We're sometimes going to be misunderstood and say the wrong thing to the wrong person. But is there intent to reconnect? Is there repair? Right? So we need to developmentally use appropriate play and Brazelton's approach to support this dance, because in infancy and toddlers and even ongoing, it's really about the dance. So the point is the locus is moving. It starts out with the caregiver, then it's all about the dance. And then hopefully if we're doing a good job, we're working ourselves out of a job, right? So beginning in preschool, but then always for improvement, the child becomes the locus of affect regulation, right? Self-regulation is the objective, and it begins to develop as a child learns adaptive ways to cope with strong emotions. There's nothing wrong with strong emotions if there are safe, stable, nurturing relationships to help them model, teach, practice, and actually celebrate those skills. So this gets in then older kids, this idea of social emotional learning, which, is beyond me why it's become so controversial right now. It's not about values or character formation. These are basic skills that kids need to be successful, just like math and reading. So the Collaborative for Academic and Social Emotional Learning says it's the process through which children and adults as well understand and manage emotions. Again, there's the affect regulation, set and achieve positive goals, feel empathy, compassion, right, for others, establish and maintain positive relationships, and make responsible decisions. The important point here is that these are skills that are learned, right? It may come easy, it may come hard, but they still can be modeled, taught, practiced, and reinforced. And then we get into this issue of celebrating, right? How does our culture celebrate these skills? How do we celebrate and raise up that this is what's important? Mr. Rogers is probably the last person who really celebrated the emotion, right? Sesame Street probably comes close, and the only show I can watch these days is Ted Lasso, if you're familiar with Ted Lasso, because he's basically saying it's okay to be kind. It's good to be kind. There actually is another effort undergoing at the Harvard Graduate School for Education called Making Caring Common, right? Where it's celebrating the fact that being caring and being empathic and being compassionate, that's actually probably the best predictor of having a happy child. So if you want your child to be happy, they don't necessarily need to be bright. They don't need all the material goods, but they need to be compassionate. That's the best predictor of children being happy. And so all those skills are modeled and celebrated by those safe, stable, and nurturing relationships. But it all starts with this, again, this self-regulation, this awareness, this affect regulation. And we don't do a very good job at helping kids know, strong emotions, that's a normal part of being human. They're okay. You're not broken because you have a strong emotion. The challenge is to be aware, to normalize and learn healthy adaptations, right? And so we really want to sort of build distress tolerance, right? It's not that there's something wrong with you because you feel this emotion. It's okay. What are we going to do about it? So the way I talk about it with older kids is, when you have a strong emotion, you need a distraction. You need something to turn off that stress response. But there's sort of 3 buckets of distractions. There are unhealthy distractions. That's the behavioral allostasis we talked about before, fighting, smoking, drinking, promiscuity. On the short term, they may turn off their stress response, but in the long run, they're very maladaptive, right? And then there's a whole bucket of things that are sort of passive entertainment, right? They're sort of wastes of time, but they're escapes, right? The YouTube, the internet, the social media, video games, it's a way of distracting yourself, but you're not really building yourself into a better person. And then there are the healthy distractions: play, art, sports, music, the passions. Those are actually building skills. And so if when I have a big emotion, this is what I do to turn it off. This is how I feel good. This is how I have my confidence, have my autonomy. And even better, if I have my connection, that's how I'm building resilience, right? And so the point is that those safe, stable, nurturing relationships help kids channel that emotional energy into something constructive, right? So we've had a developmental lens, right? And the developmental lens is all about the fact that it's a moving target, right? That the locus starts with the parents, then a dance, and then hopefully a self-regulation. So the last lens I'm going to share with you, because I know we're getting along in time here, is the public health approach, right? This is a complex issue, right? There's going to be no magic bullet here. We need layered efforts, and we need to be across different sectors, not just in healthcare, not just in education, not just in juvenile justice. It needs to be across sectors. So just to frame this for us, relational health is a paradigm shift, right? From a deficits-based to a strengths-based approach. And it has the potential to transform the way we train educators and policemen and pediatricians, their funding, the way we practice, the research, and most importantly, our advocacy and policy. But operationalizing it is going to require a layered efforts, again, which is sometimes called vertical integration, with universal primary, secondary, and tertiary interventions that go across sectors that interface with children and families. So there's vertical integration and horizontal integration across sectors. So what would that look like? Well, first, I'd like to just sort of take a step back and refresh everyone's memory so we're all on the same page of what the classic public health pyramid looks like. And we're going to use lead poisoning just as an example. So the public health has sort of the classic pyramid, has different levels with primary preventions, secondary preventions, and tertiary preventions. And so I just almost think of this sort of shorthandedly as be well, stay well, and then get well, right? And so the population, primary preventions are for everybody. They're universal primary preventions. They're trying to prevent disease in the first place. And a good example of that is removing lead from products like gasoline and paint. Secondary preventions are targeted. These are targeted for those who may be at higher risk. And the idea is to identify risks in early disease. So you may then screen for lead based on their zip code, right? And so that's a secondary intervention. And then tertiary intervention, these are indicated treatments for those who have diseases. So if you actually have lead poisoning, we want to treat that and prevent it progressing. We're going to do chelation therapy on those kids, right? So the point is that all levels are necessary. No one's going to say we can fix lead poisoning by just chelating. No, we have to get rid of lead out of paint and gas. And so the point is that all of these levels are necessary. None of them are sufficient. And so there's a temptation to have a magic bullet. We're just going to chelate, or we're just going to screen, or we're just going to get removed lead. You need to do all of them, right? So let's think about how this applies to toxic stress. So the universal primary preventions would be things like positive parenting, promoting positive parenting, development appropriate play, things like shared reading, consistent messaging about what the biologic needs of kids are. Secondary interventions would be screening for things that put kids at risk for parent and child adversity, things like the social determinants of health. There is an active effort to try and identify biomarkers that are looking at the stress response. So these kids have higher interleukin levels, or they have higher levels of methylation patterns. Those kids may be at higher risk for toxic stress. So we want to target our interventions on those particular kids. And then there are tertiary treatments. These are evidence-based treatments, things like attachment and biobehavioral catch-up, parent-child interaction therapy, child-parent psychotherapy, and trauma-informed cognitive behavioral therapy. These are evidence-based treatments that treat kids who have toxic stress-related diagnoses. But again, toxic stress is sort of a deficits-based approach. It's telling us how things are going wrong. What if we flip that around and had a public health approach to promote relational health? And if you think about it, all these examples here, they're perfect examples of promoting relational health. So positive parenting and consistent messaging, that's promoting safe, stable, and nurturing relationships in a 2-generational manner. We're building those relational skills in a 2-generational way. And by identifying these risks, we're identifying and addressing potential barriers to relational health, barriers to forming safe, stable, nurturing relationships. That doesn't mean that kids that parents have had adversity or a kid grows up in poverty, that they're doomed to not have relational health. That's not true, but we acknowledge that makes it harder. So we need to have extra supports for them. And then all these interventions, attachment and biobehavioral catch-up, parent-child interaction therapy, at a certain level, they're all about repairing strained or compromised relationships. The point is that a public health approach to prevent toxic stress, preventing the bad stuff, actually is a public health approach to promote the good stuff, the relational health, right? And no one would ever say that, I hope you're still there. Hopefully you all can hear me, but I got some weird Charter for Compassion symbol up here. Can you all hear me still?
Yes.
Yeah,
Okay, perfect. Okay. So,
We're here.
oh, yeah, perfect. So if you want to think about these briefly, relational health is the universal primary prevention, addressing the social determinants of health and adverse child experiences, the secondary, and trauma-informed care is the tertiary, right? And so our objective here, again, is a layered approach. We can't just have one, we want to have layered. And so this is the perfect example of vertical integration. We want to have a system that's integrated vertically, where we're matching needs with interventions. But then what about horizontal intervention? What about across sectors? I have just one more slide that goes, oh, no, sorry, I jumped ahead. So if that's true, and we want to have this sort of public health approach, why isn't it working? It's working because our pyramid currently is upside down, right? And what I mean by that is there are evidence-based interventions to repair relational health. That's what everyone keeps talking about. We need more psychiatrists. We need more relationalists. We need more therapists. We need more counselors. And we definitely do. But there are these evidence-based practices are expensive, they're labor and time intensive, and they're hard to access those providers. And demand already outstrips the supply, and the demand is just increasing, right? So we're putting all this emphasis on the treatment. What about going upstream a little bit and doing sort of secondary preventions and identifying the barriers? And there is a growing movement to identify the barriers, the social determinants of health and poverty and racism, and try and address those. But there are not enough community resources available currently to address those barriers. And then what about the universal primary preventions, which really should be the foundation of the public health pyramid, right? Supporting families in their communities, that's the foundation, but it's not a priority, right? I mean, it actually runs counter to the financial incentives currently in healthcare, which prioritize procedures over relationships and quantity over quality. So again, a layered approach is going to work, but only if we're having universal primary preventions and relational health as the foundation of the pyramid. So again, there's vertical integration. What about horizontal integration across sectors? And to just drive this point home, I'd like to think about these ecological circles and the fact that relational health begins at a dyadic level, right? So as a pediatrician, I think of it as being dyadic. And so does the caregiver and the child, do they both feel safe, connected, and supported? If they don't, then they're both going to be in survival mode. And if they do, they're both going to be in relational mode, right? So they feel safe, connected, and supported. And if they're in relational mode, that's going to promote relational health. And obviously in a survival mode, that's going to hinder relational health. But then what about the next ecological level? What about what's happening at the familial level, right? So if there's relational trauma due to intimate partner violence or parental mental illness or substance abuse, that's going to hinder the relational health of the dyad. But if there's family resilience and connection, like Christina Beth looked at, that's going to actually promote relational health. Well, then what happens sort of at the neighborhood level, right? If there's unstable housing, there's neighborhood violence, that can hinder the relational health. But if there's safe places to live, connect, and play, that's going to promote relational health. And what about at the deployment level, right? So if the caregivers are discriminated against or there's unemployment, that's going to hinder the relational health at the dyadic level. But if there's opportunities for growth and livable wages, again, that opportunity for competence and connection, that's going to promote relational health. And then what about just happens at the stranger level, right? Are there microaggressions or is there kindness? Is there compassion, right? And then what happens sort of at a societal level? Is there structural isolation and racism, or is actually social inclusion and diversity is actually valued, right? So horizontal integration is necessary across all family serving connectors sectors because it's going to impact the relational health at the dyadic level. But the good news, the opposite's true too, right? So early relational health, getting that right at the dyadic level, as those children grow up and be caregivers themselves, that's going to influence the other spheres as well, right? Which is why James Heckman, who's an economist, has said there's really strong returns on investment economically for investments in children with families. So you can have an economic argument, you can have an ethical or moral argument. And what I've tried to lay out in these two presentations is a biological argument, right? That there are certain biological things that kids need in order to thrive, right? And so, the words of Frederick Douglass, I'm paraphrasing here, that, it's easier to build strong children than to repair broken men and women, right? So I'm just going to conclude, though, with this quote from John Bowlby. So John Bowlby is sort of is an important American psychologist who really sort of started teasing out the importance of childhood attachment. And he wrote a report for the World Health Organization more than 20 years ago that said, if the community values its children, it must cherish their parents. And so that, in my mind, really encapsulates the two-generational approach that I was talking about before. So two-generational, developmental, and a public health approach. If we can combine those approaches, then I think we have a chance of actually creating a culture of relational health. So how do we move beyond toxic stress? That would be my suggestion. A public health approach that's layered, a developmental approach that acknowledges it's a moving target, and a two-generational approach to help the parents to help their kids. And so that leaves us a lot of time for questions, and I would be happy to answer any if there are any.
I know there have to be a lot of questions and maybe some comments. So just open it up, and if you would use your reactions and maybe your hand up if you'd like to speak or ask a question. And I see a hand going up. Guard.
So Dr. Garner, absolutely brilliant. I want the whole world to see this PowerPoint.
Thank
So
you.
I'm going to send it to my small portion.
Okay.
So a friend of mine, Abigail Marsh, you may know her. She's from Georgetown. She's a neuroscientist. She's done a lot of work on the amygdala.
Yeah.
And her work indicates that you can actually grow the amygdala, and that sociopathic behavior is associated with small amygdalas, and that altruistic behaviors or kindness actually can be found where there are larger amygdalas. And she's done this looking at people who are kidney transplant donors. You may be familiar with her work, but can you speak to that at all in terms of regulation?
Yeah, so I think first of all, though, that I want to discuss this issue about the size, because in neuroscience, one of the principles is that structure does not equate to function. And I think that's a really good example, right? Because just in terms of size doesn't help us very much, because you were pointing out that, a larger amygdala, gee, that may be associated with compassion. But if you look at kids that are Romanian orphans, they have bigger amygdalas too, and they're completely disinhibited, right? They're like feral, right? So the point is that looking at a structure and the size doesn't necessarily relate to its function. It's about connectivity. And yes, it's true. There are different parts to the amygdala that do different things. And so in general, when people think about the amygdala, we think about the limbic system, we think about being impulsive, we think about being aggressive, again, thinking at those Romanian orphans. But that's not the whole story. That's a really simplistic way of trying to understand it, which is the way I'm trying to present it simplistically to help people understand survival mode versus relational mode. But clearly the amygdala does much more than that. At a more sophisticated level, people would say the role of the amygdala is to give emotional valence to memories. So what that means is that when you have a memory, is it a good memory or is it a bad memory? Is it scary or bad, black and white? And you can sort of expect an organ that's involved with impulsive reflective decisions to do that, right? And so the amygdala, what's get triggered, like if you're walking along a trail someday and you jump back and you realize, oh, that was just a stick, but my brain thought it was a snake. That was your amygdala trying to keep you safe. So it's reflexive. It's trying to keep you safe, which is why it develops early in development. But you point out an important thing, which is that when you just look at structure, that doesn't necessarily imply function, right? And that's why you can say, well, geez, kids that were born and raised in Romanian orphanages, they are disinhibited, they are aggressive, they have bigger amygdalas. Well, big amygdalas must be bad. Well, no, that kind of big amygdala may be bad. But on the other hand, if you can actually train the amygdala to have positive emotional thoughts, positive connection, positive, then that can actually be a good thing too. So does that make sense? I think what you're getting at there is this distinction between structure and function.
It does make sense. And that's maybe where epigenetics steps in, where again, certain behaviors can turn on certain things.
Absolutely. And again, what parts of the amygdala? So the amygdala may be big because it's connecting to positive memories or may connecting to negative memories, right? And so that doesn't necessarily help us very much in terms of just the size telling us how that's going to work out.
Yeah, it seems to me that you have to talk about the hippocampus and its function and the prefrontal cortex and how that dynamic is going on to produce the altruistic individual that jumps in the freezing lake to save the dog, you know.
If you really want to learn and go into the real weeds in this stuff, there's a book by Robert Sapolsky, who wrote a book called Behave. So he also wrote a book called Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers, right? So he was also sort of approaching this from my perspective in terms of stress response and understanding stress. And so he's a scientist. I think he used to be at Stanford, and then maybe, I don't know, he's in California. But the point is, he wrote a book called Behave that goes into all the neuroscience behind this and how the best and the worst of human behavior can come from the amygdala.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Yeah. Other questions, comments? I'm intrigued by this idea, not the idea, but the bottom line of this multi-layered, and yet from a charter for compassion, social emotional learning from cradle to the grave. I have to say that I'm biased in the sense of we're addressing, the cow out of the barn in our CIT approach. But somehow I'd love to see the cow sort of stay in the barn and learn how to meander around. And that brings me to a real focus on parents and the relationship of parents and kids. And how can we, from a public health perspective, do a better job of intervening, or not intervening, but rather supporting this dyadic dance that you talk about. Any comments about that and maybe the way ahead, my friend?
I think in general, we're suffering from empathy deficit disorder as a society. And while we may have a little empathy for the kids because, well, they shouldn't get punished because they're parents, we've failed to see that by not having empathy for the parents, we're not really going to reach the kids. You know what I mean? I mean, we have to find a better way to make empathy and caring common. I see there's a hand raised.
Yeah, Margie.
Thanks, Dr. Garner. That was really interesting. Thank you. I tell you what I've been reading quite a lot about is Steve Porges's polyvagal theory.
Yeah.
And it goes back to what you're talking about. It's how we go into dysregulation, co-regulation, self-regulation. And I think it does go back to parental stress. There's a tremendous amount of stress, and not only stress, but trauma.
Yeah.
The amount of trauma. And that's the basis sometimes from which people are operating, is just survival due to that amount of trauma that goes on. But that polyvagal theory is, I found, really helpful in terms of regulation, co-regulation, and dysregulation.
Absolutely.
So thank you.
Wholeheartedly agree. Yep. Yeah, I think the important thing to remember about from a developmental perspective is that the way the kids are going to see themselves is the way the parents see them, right? And so if the parent is in survival mode, we're all in survival mode at some point. We can't constantly be connected with our kids. That's okay. But if we're able to take that time to reconnect, like it's basically telling the kid, you are a priority. I'm going to reconnect with you when I can. I'm going to find some time to sit and read with you. Your emotions are important and valued. Then the kid begins to see themselves like that. But if the parents are in survival mode because of what's happened to them, then the kids begin to see themselves as being incompetent, as being difficult, as being a burden. And so again, it can go both ways, right? And I think the point with the ACE study is that most kids have ACEs and positive experiences that coexist in their lives. It's not like it's one or the other. There are two different axes that coexist. And so, yes, we need to prevent the adversity, but we also need to promote the good stuff. But it's really hard to promote the good stuff if we're not promoting the good stuff for everybody. But I appreciate your nod to polyvagal therapy. Absolutely. And they all are synergistic. I don't tend to use that frame very often for lay folk, but it's totally synergistic.
Guard. Mm-hmm.
So I serve on the board for longevity at Stanford, and
Yes.
Robert Still is there, and there's another neuroscientist there, Jamil Zaki, who's written a book called The War for Kindness. And what he observes is that we have a pandemic in terms of relational strength in our culture, that most people have. You want to guess how many people they can trust? Most people have 0 people that they can trust. And that this is really more true in urban cultures than in rural cultures. And that this is growing by the year. It's getting worse and worse and worse. And so again, that relational portion that Bruce Perry talks about is so important. But I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts on how we begin to reverse that, because it seems like we're living in a culture of toxic fear right now.
Oh, there's no doubt about it. In fact, the AAP policy statement that came out in August that I co-wrote last August had a whole section. The heading was the role and the toll of social isolation. And that really is and in fact, if you talk to Felidi and Anda, they were the lead investigators on the adverse childhood experiences study. They'll tell you that they think the real toxicity of childhood adversity is the social stigma that goes along with it, the social isolation that comes from it. This idea that you weren't worthy, that you were different. If people knew this about you, that you would be different and thought of differently. So yes, I think that is an important component, no question, that the idea of the social isolation, and if you think about it, I mean, just as society has changed, I mean, we used to grow up in not really kibbutzes, but we used to have extended families. I mean, aunts and uncles would be down the street, and if you weren't able to be in sync with your one parent, you were in sync with the other parent. If you weren't in sync with both your parents, then you had aunts, uncles, and other people you were in sync with, and so there was always that opportunity for synchrony somewhere. And now we don't have it, right? And so, you're right. The American Academy of Pediatrics and the CDC have a social media campaign called Know Your Three, meaning that if you have 3 people you can turn to, you're going to do better. So think about who are your 3, and if there aren't people that are in your core, how do we invite them into your core? How do you have those 3 people that you are connected with? Social isolation is and actually there's an interesting study from Matthew Pantel. It sort of does an ACE study where they basically look, instead of measures of adversity, look at measures of social isolation, and you see the same sort of thing. The more socially isolated you are, the less friends you have, the less you have connections in your community, less faith community, less connections, the higher risk for early death and all kinds of poor outcomes. So there's no doubt that social isolation is a major role in all of this.
Could you maybe Know Your Three? That sounds really important. I'd love to see the link for that, Charlie, if we could get a hold of that.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's through the CDC and the American Academy of Pediatrics. It may not even be something on their website, but if you are on social media, things like Twitter and Instagram, I'm sure that Know Your Three is going to be the hashtag Know Your Three is something that they've been promoting to try and get to reach people who may not be, necessarily on looking at the latest research, but maybe still using social media.
Yeah. Very practical stuff. I've got 3 right here on the screen, so I'm doing good.
Yeah, that's the question that I would ask me. I keep going to the infant and toddler. Well, they don't know who their 3 are yet. And by the time they have any idea that they need a 3, like I said, the cow may already be out of the barn, and we're behind the 8 ball. So, again, I say, what can we do? What can we do from a public health perspective? What can we advocate? what can we push forward that will hopefully make a difference for our society and the global society as well. Any thoughts along those lines?
I mentioned a few. I mean, I think that, it sounds crazy, but, even a show like Ted Lasso, which, has been, the thing I don't know if you're familiar with Ted Lasso, but it's a show that I don't watch a lot of TV. And all of my friends would tell me you had to watch it, which are pediatricians. All the pediatricians were like going gaga over this guy. Like, you've got to watch this show. You've got to watch this show. I'm like, I don't understand why everyone thinks this is so cool. And then Jason Sudeikis appeared on Saturday Night Live and said, yeah, I'm surprised my show's a hit because it's about two things most Americans don't care about: soccer and being kind. And I was like, yeah, that's why. I mean, it's basically a show where the kind guy, the guy who knows nothing about soccer, but is able to have relational health with everyone around him, you end up rooting for him. And so I just wish there were more models of that, because when we look on the news and we look on all things today are conflict. The more conflict, the more violence, the more synchronous, the better, the more salacious, right? And I think that's a major problem, is we don't raise up people that are being kind, people that are, saying that if you want happiness, you want your kid to learn how to be kind. That's the most important thing.
Other comments, questions from some who have not spoken yet. Marita.
Yeah, I thought it was fascinating. I really congratulate you, Andrew, because this is kind of like all the information we've been looking for put into one spot, and it's like a little treasure, this conference. But how do we actually, isn't there a simpler way? I've felt really overwhelmed with that final circle, like all the things. Where do we go? Where do we head to directly? Is there something simple we could give each one of those stages to make this has to boom, and it has to be fast, because there's a lot of, as we've just mentioned, and as we mentioned at the beginning, there's young kids wanting to be murderers before wanting to be a scientist or a waiter. It doesn't matter. We're not expecting everybody to be scientists, no?
Right.
How do we do this?
Yeah, I agree with you. I'm not sure. I mean, I know that that's a temptation, is to try and, try and find one thing. I mean, I think that is the problem, is that we really have, again, this rolling toll of social isolation, and we have a societal disease. We've lost our way at a biological level. The thing that triggers the most stress response from a person is not actually pain. It's social isolation, which is why, some communities like the Amish use shunning. Like, that's like the worst possible thing, because that is stress. The reason we're here is because we were able to connect and understand each other, just looking at the eye and being able to connect. That's how we were able to survive. And so we're sort of losing our most basic thing. So I agree that there's not a simple thing. I mean, I know we want one thing, one magic bullet. I do think that bringing it into bits and layering on is the way to think about it. So yes, we definitely need more treatments, because there are kids that are waiting in emergency rooms that are suicidal for days because there's no place for them to go. So do we need more treatment? Absolutely. Do we need to go upstream and, like Charlie's saying, prevent the cow from leaving the barn? Absolutely. And there are ways to identify kids that are at risk and get those things. But do we need to fundamentally change the social contract? Absolutely. We need to focus on the relational health. We have to focus on taking care of each other and seeing each other as humans and hearing the other. We've sort of lost that. And so yes, it's overwhelming, but I think that if we can start with that, compassion is the principle, start with that, relational health is the principle, then I think the other things fall from that. You know what I mean? I think if we begin to see each other as what is that? That each of us have that spark, divinity in each of us, then I think it makes it a little easier to say, well, of course we need to have interventions, and of course we need treatments, but it has to start at that relational level. So where do you start? Again, I think I apply the same practice to my practice, right? So as a pediatrician, I do my very best to promote relational health and promote dyadic health. I'm going to do things to try and identify kids at a risk, either because of poverty or food insecurity or parental mental illness. And I'm going to make sure I know the resources in my community to send families to when they need help. And so that's trying to apply that integrated thing. The challenge, like you said, is going across sectors, right? And that's where advocacy becomes so important. And that's why I talked about Heckman. There's an economic argument. We're going to save money in the long run if we invest now. There's an ethical and moral argument, but there's also a biological argument that can be made that and we're cutting our nose to spite our face if we're not getting things right the first time, if we're not helping families with young kids.
Another question that came up to me just right now as you're speaking, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but do we know where society broke?
So that's a great question. My wife thinks that society broke with Survivor. She said that when the show Survivor came out, it glorified being duplicitous and backstabbing and doing your own thing. And it's sort of like I was saying, that it sort of glorified it's okay to gaslight, it's okay to lie, it's okay to stab someone in the back. It's all about number one. So I'm not really blaming Survivor, but I do think that mentality, win at all costs, is something that makes me absolutely stark raving mad. The win at all costs, whether it's in business, it's not personal, it's business. Win at all costs. That is a justification of being completely self-absorbed and not acknowledging the other, right? And so I don't know when it happened, but I think that it is sort of the problem with unchecked capitalism is that it's all about me. And so, yeah, you can call me a socialist if you want to, but there is something very, very primal about, it's win at all costs, win at all costs, win at all costs. So I think that the American archetype of being an individual and raising up a business, that's very powerful and very true. But it doesn't justify win at all costs. And I think that's the line that I think we have not negotiated very well. There have to be guardrails, there have to be limits. And when we can't agree on basic certain principles, then we're in trouble as a society.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Garner. This has really been we're coming up on the hour, and this has been most excellent, thought-provoking, inspiring, and lots of more conversation. But more than conversation is to look at where we can intervene as individuals, like Dr. Garner does in his practice, as well as collectively in terms of moving society in the direction of relational health. So thank you, Dr. Garner, for part 2 of your 2 parts, both of which are excellent and both of which will be recorded on the Charter's website under the EdNet Forum page. And so I would encourage you, if you want to know more or review some of this, because it's robust and it's very comprehensive. So thank you, Dr. Garner, on behalf of everyone who's present today. I'll turn it over to Marilyn, who will give us kind of the way ahead with regard to the EdNet Forum. Marilyn?
Here I am, and I just want to share with you that the very next EdNet Forum is on June 16th, and it's with Rabbi David Gilfner, who is from Israel, but his programs, from what I understand, the Loving Classrooms, are very prominent in South Africa as well as in Europe. So we'll have an opportunity to talk with him to see what is happening in Loving Classrooms. And then on July 7th, we'll have the Awakened Schools, and that is with Lisa Miller. And Lisa is the person who wrote about the awakened brain, but also the spiritual child. So she will be with us on the 7th. So usually these are always on the 1st and the 3rd Thursdays of each month. And so we hope that you'll put those in, save your date, and we'll see you then. Thanks so much, everyone, and especially to you, Dr. Gardner.
Thank you.
Thank you very
so
much.
much,
Thank you.
And hope to see you in the future. Bye-bye.
Bye.